That is actually very good. You know, Ed Markey is the senator from Massachusetts. He was running against Joe Kennedy, a real Kennedy. And Joe's like, 34 years old, and he's handsome and wonderful red hair, and everybody just assumed that he was going to mop up an old Markey who was 76 years old. But Markey had a commercial, and the background music was from 9 Inch Nails. Now, I don't really know 9 Inch Nails that well, but I know enough that it gave a little bit of an edge to an octogenarian, and he ended up beating Kennedy. Great to see so many friends. It's almost like memory lane. I see Lloyd Daniel. The first time I said him, you played for LSU, you must have been a safety. No, I was a guard. I was thinking, whoa, something's different. And Carol mentioned I was a gastroenterologist. My old laugh line is that, why did you run for office? I said, well, as a gastroenterologist, every morning I would go in, I would see the same thing. And frankly, I got tired of the views. So, the high school students won't quite get it, but, if you're over 50, I think you do. And it's a real pleasure to speak to you today about the bipartisan infrastructure bill, because I think it gives us an opportunity as a state to catch up with states that have gone a little bit ahead of us, to prepare for the future so that these high school students, our children, our grandchildren, will be better prepared for that future. And I'll intro just by saying this. It's a truism that oftentimes your strength is your weakness. Think about our state. We've got so many strengths. Think of our geology. The Mississippi River flows from the inland of the United States through our state. We've got 3 of the largest ports in the world by tonnage in our state. I once heard the Australian ambassador say the difference between Australia and the United States is you have the Mississippi River and we have a desert. That river's huge. We got natural resources. We have natural resources in a sense that companies move here not just for the oil, not just for the natural gas. They move here for our salt domes because they need the chloride to make their product. We are blessed with natural resources. And we got an incredible geology. Hey, Linda, nice to see you. And yet within that strength comes weakness. Have you ever noticed a map of where hurricanes tend to go? They just head for that mouth of that Mississippi River. You do a scatter graph and it kind of centers right there on our coastline. If you look at the geology, our geology is great. It benefits us with natural resources, but it's also a little bit of I won't say a curse, but the weakness is that our land is sinking and we're losing it into the ocean. And our natural resources have given us so many jobs, but it's made us dependent upon fossil fuel for those jobs in a future which will demand a lower carbon intensity. And whatever you think about that, it doesn't matter. We are going to have a lower carbon intensity future, and if we don't adapt, those jobs go away. Now, the reason why I like the bipartisan infrastructure bill is that it builds upon our strengths and it compensates us for our weaknesses, and it brings us to a point where we will be able to better compete with those states that surround us. Let me give some examples. On our geography, have you ever noticed that if you're going east, west, or south from East Baton Rouge Parish, you've got to cross a bridge? Yeah, so you don't get anywhere, you don't get out of the state east and west unless you cross a bridge. We are surrounded by water. Now, that's wonderful. We have these wonderful ports, but those bridges need upkeep, and those bridges become overwhelmed. In the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there's going to be $5.8 billion coming to Louisiana for roads and bridges. When it comes to bridges, because it's a little top-heavy there, Louisiana does 7th best in the nation in terms of the money we receive relative to the formula for our bridges. The state has already announced their big projects. One of them is to do a lot of work on the Mississippi River Bridge in Baton Rouge, to replace the Calcasieu Ship Channel, to do I-49 South in Lafayette, I-49 North in Shreveport, to 6-lane the I-12 through the Florida parishes from the Amite to the Pearl, and to build more on the I-10 connecting the airport in Kenner to the I-10. That's incredible. That will bring our state not to where it needs to be, but certainly far beyond where it is now. Important in terms of ports and waterways. We've got the strength of all these big ports. You got to maintain it. There's about $9 billion in this bill for ports and waterways. Now, that is not just to bring corn and rice and other commodities out of the inland of the United States. It creates a heck of a lot of jobs here. And the degree to which we support those is the degree to which we support the jobs that these young people are going to lead on. Flooding. Now, we got great geography, but if you haven't noticed, we tend to have a little bit of extra water. $3.5 billion to mitigate risk of flooding. And I smile when I say this, because some folks have said, now, by the way, I've gotten a little bit of criticism lately, if you haven't noticed, and not just from my wife. And some of the criticism I got was that I would dare to debate, or should I dare to engage with the president and with Democrats, speaking as a Republican, to come up with this bill. Why would you even speak with them? You speak with them because if you're in the room, you're more likely to get the needs addressed to the people whom you represent. So there's $3.5 billion going to mitigate flood, prioritizing areas in our country which have recently flooded. Now, that doesn't spell out Louisiana. That says Louisiana. And since Louisiana has made 1/3 of the claims on the National Flood Insurance Program in the last X number of years, that says Louisiana. And if you flooded in 2016, this can benefit you. Coastal restoration. The Army Corps is getting $17 billion for resilience. $2 to $3 billion of it is going for coastal restoration, prioritizing areas in our country that have been hit by natural disasters in the last 6 years. And I smile. They said that Russell Long used to put provisions in the tax code that went something, well, Ted Kennedy described it as this: a one-legged pirate with a patch over his right eye and a hook on his left arm, wearing a red bandana and a crooked hat. The point being that you can draft a law that doesn't say a company in particular, but happens to benefit a particular company. Now, by the way, do I think it's in our country's interest that Louisiana's coastline is restored? Absolutely. We only have to look at the devastations from Laura, Ida, and Katrina to know the consequences of a coastline that is eroding. So I say this not as someone who's trying to do something that's bad. I'm saying this is bringing federal resources to our state that will benefit our state, but those benefits will extend to the rest of the country. And this bill does that. Inherent in all this, think about the jobs being created. Think about the firms that are going to be doing that coastal restoration work, the elevation of the homes, the pump stations that mitigate that flood risk. Those will create jobs for our fellow Louisianians. We got great natural resources. You know, I just learned today that petrochemical has surpassed oil and gas, upstream oil and gas, as the largest industry in our state. I think I know that to be true. And again, we're blessed by natural resources. But if you speak to those plant managers, they're going to tell you unless we lower the carbon intensity of our products, we will no longer have access to markets in the European Union. And so there's going to be this continued push. They're worried about stranded assets. If we have an energy-intensive manufacturing process, will we be able to still sell those products overseas if it is so carbon-intensive? There's $5.1 billion in this bill. It's included in an amendment that Chris Coons, a fellow from Delaware, and I drafted, that will help finance carbon dioxide pipelines, taking carbon dioxide from where the plant is producing the product and sequestering it in our geology in a saline aquifer. In that way, we continue to use the natural gas that we produce so plentifully, but we do it in a way in which we capture the emissions. And if you're going to ship your good to the European Union, you will preferentially be the vendor of choice because you've been able to produce it in a manner which does not have carbon intensity. If you are Dow and you have made a commitment to net carbon neutrality by 2030, and you're trying to decide where am I going to expand my next manufacturing plant? Well, wait, we have a commitment to carbon neutrality. And Louisiana has not only the geology, but they also have the pipeline infrastructure and the regulatory code so that we can meet our net carbon neutrality and still expand our chemical plant. With this bill, we make this a go-to destination for those companies that wish to expand. Not just those who are already here, but those who wish to come in for the first time. This is about expanding our economy, about the jobs for those folks who are not in this room, but are depending upon the leadership of folks in this room in order to have a better future for themselves and their kids. I could go through a couple other things. Again, when you're in the room, you can do some things that are good. So-called hydrogen hubs that will take natural gas and take methane, if you will. Again, I smile as a gastroenterologist. My experience with methane was always so different. But you take methane and you can use that methane to make hydrogen, and you would sequester the carbon, but then ship that hydrogen around the world. That is going to be a huge market. There's already Air Products. In Ascension is already doing this, taking the carbon from making hydrogen from natural gas and sequestering the carbon so they can ship that hydrogen overseas. This is already happening. This will help our state build it out even more. Direct air capture, which frankly, direct air capture, you take air, you take the carbon out, you sequester the carbon. I'm sitting there looking at it, reading about direct air capture. It works best in a hot, humid environment. I'm thinking, hello, I volunteer my state. And so we have provisions in here which Louisiana is poised to compete for demonstration projects for large direct air capture, making us not just a place which produces carbon-intensive products, but a place which sequesters the carbon, which poises us for even greater growth. I'll mention a couple other things because I would like to have some time for questions. There's other things as well. I got a wonderful job. Again, I get a lot more variety than I formerly did, but you get to meet people and you get to understand which makes them tick. So I was speaking to the Alexandria Chamber of Commerce, and a fellow from Avoyelles Parish came up. Now you go through our old parishes, our parishes which are rural, and they're kind of in decline. And you'll go down the street and there'll be a nice old home with a broad veranda, but it's clearly got a faded glory. And the folks that once there, the banker, he's moved on or she's moved on, the family's moved on. But there's still folks there. And what we've seen though with COVID is people are tired of wearing masks and living cooped up. And so younger people are moving back to the rural area. They feel safer, but they only move back if they have certain amenities. It's my theory in life, a man only lives where either Uncle Sam or his wife tells him to. And my wife once told me a woman will not move to a place unless there is a good healthcare system, a good elementary school for her child, a place to go for her anniversary dinner, a grocery store, and she's added to that list broadband internet. Because with broadband internet, if your daughter wants to take Mandarin and it's not available in the local school, she can take Mandarin. If your son has a problem with mental health, your son can communicate via telemental health. If your husband is Zooming from home, he can Zoom from home. If she's starting a business, she can do so as well. And on Saturday night, you can watch Netflix. You do not have economic development without broadband internet. So there's a guy from Avoyelles, he came up to me afterwards. And of everything I was talking about, he said, I really like the broadband internet. My daughters live away, but they would like to move back to Avoyelles, but they won't move back unless we have broadband. I mean, it's like he took my message and he was giving my wife's message back to me. So the wonderful thing about, if you think about what he said just here, he goes, because he had worked for AT&T, he knew completely the implications of telecom. And he goes, if we build it, they will come. Now, he could have been saying his daughters. He could have been saying the distribution center that will only go where there's broadband internet so they can. Or he could mean that whole virtuous cycle where the daughters move back and the distribution centers moves back and the jobs begin to accumulate and the tax base improves and the school, that whole virtuous cycle. He could have been saying that. And he would have been true for all. So the wonderful thing about this plan, I really think that with the infrastructure, in all the different ways we've defined it, that if we build it, folks will come. And perhaps they won't leave. And there'll be that virtuous cycle that takes our state into the next decades and has prosperity in our state, as opposed to us looking over the border and seeing that prosperity in other states. That's what this bill does, compensating for our weaknesses and building upon our strengths. I would love whatever questions you have, because I'd rather speak to your question as opposed to guess what's on your mind. But thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Yes?
Senator, I've seen all kinds of percentages in different publications about what the percentage of the bill, the 1.2 trillion, how much is really infrastructure?
What a great question. I love that question. So there's $550 billion of new infrastructure, and it's a $1.2 trillion bill. $600 billion of it is already going for things that the government would otherwise fund. Department of Energy, Commerce Department, EPA, already agencies that are already there. So the $600 billion is there, $500 billion for new infrastructure spending. I've heard people say that only 11% is going for infrastructure. Well, let me just rattle numbers off the top of my head, and we'll quickly be over 11%, which would be about, what, 150 billion. There's 110 billion for roads and bridges. There's 65 billion for freight and passenger rail. There's $50 billion for resiliency, including 17 billion coming to the Army Corps of Engineers. I think there's 25 billion for FAA. There's $50 billion for water projects. 380 million or so will be coming to Louisiana next year so that a community near you can begin to redo their sewer and water systems. There is 8 billion or 9 billion for the hydrogen hubs. I think there's 17 billion for ports and waterways. Did I mention the 65 billion for internet? Clearly, I'm over 150 billion. And I'm approaching over 500 billion. Now, there's some things you might say, well, it's not really infrastructure. There's 21 billion to clean up Superfund sites, brownfield sites, and to cap abandoned oil and gas wells. But there's some things you can't do unless you clean up clinical mess. There's 25 billion, as I mentioned, for FAA. You can't expand a runway if there's an old flame retardant called PFAS in the dirt. You've got to clean up the PFAS first before you can expand the runway. So even the stuff for the environmental cleanup has a certain rationale in enabling what we're doing. So I can, if I pulled up my list, I would give you 500 something billion. That number you've read has been misinformation, and and I'm so glad you asked it, because you gave me a chance to kind of to take off.
Could you expound on why I think about half of it is legitimate infrastructure myself, but the other half you said was going to be spent anyway?
Oh, $600 billion to fund the federal government. So the EPA, for example, has their laboratories. The Department of Energy has their laboratories. The Department of Energy is running the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And so it's all the money that would go to those agencies to fund their various activities. The infrastructure bill is on top of that. So
some other bill will be 600 billion less?
Yeah. The end of the year funding would be less because of those have already been done. Yes, sir.
So bipartisan means compromise. Can you talk about what parts of this bill, because there's got to be some that you kind of grin and bear it because of the good things it's going to do? What are some parts you don't like about this bill?
So I'm smiling. I was working at first with, there was several different groups, but I was working with a Democratic congressman from New Jersey. And he goes, Bill, and people from New Jersey speak in a way that, shall we say, is colorful. So I won't exactly quote what he said. But he said, Bill, what in the heck am I putting $6 million to cap abandoned oil and gas wells? I said, well, Josh, why am I putting so much money to some dadgum rail station in New Jersey? He goes, you're right. Take what you want for the abandoned oil and gas wells. The point is, it's a big country. People in the West ask, why does there so much for passenger rail in the Northeast? The people in the Northeast say, why is there so much money for water resiliency in the West? Both are asking, why are we putting money towards coastal restoration on the Gulf Coast? It is a big country. And in a big country, you have different needs in different areas. And in each of those areas, you can look at and say, yeah, I get it. If I was there, I would totally get it. And so actually, I feel, believe me, there's always something you don't like. But by and large, this is a pretty clean bill. Yeah. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for the work that you've done. This infrastructure bill, it's amazing. It's got so many of the things we've talked about for a long time. Congratulations.
Thank you.
There's one thing that I'm worried about, and it's the carbon capture, utilization, and storage. That is where you're putting the carbon gases underground. And in Louisiana, we don't have a very good track record for taking care of environmental issues. And so I'm very concerned. You know, we talked about the oil leaks. We know how many we have. How many did you say?
We have, in terms of the, I think we have 12 or 13. I mean, we have press here, so if I get some detail, small detail, bear with me. But I think we have 12 or 13 that are on the Superfund site. And then we have brownfield sites as well. And then we have a lot of abandoned oil and gas wells.
And we need that taken care of so badly. But I'm worried about this new pipeline underground. And how in the world are we going to take care of that effectively and continue to protect our citizens of Louisiana? We know how we're being affected by the air quality today.
Yeah, let us talk about carbon capture sequestration. Again, where you take the carbon that would be released from another process and you put it beneath the ground in a saline aquifer. That's going to be, guidelines will come from the federal government, but we actually have the ability to permit that here locally. That actually gives us a huge advantage over surrounding states. If you have to get a pipeline that crosses a state line, federal government has jurisdiction. It can take years to get that done. If you can do an intrastate pipeline, you have state jurisdiction, and the regulatory environment is much more quickly to respond. You still have EPA overlooking you, but nonetheless, the permitting can take place on an intrastate. Why I think we could end up better off than Texas, dare I say, is that we already have permission from EPA Region 6 for us to permit these pipelines. And we're seeking to get that permission for the sequestration process as well. Now, once you sequester the carbon, you've got to forever make sure that it never leaks again. So there's a lot of precautions in how you store this. And those will be followed. But I can promise you that Dow and BASF and Oxy and Procter & Gamble, when we get this right, will see our state as the go-to place to have carbon neutral production. And so I'm actually very bullish on this. It's I think it's going to be good. And we'll still have EPA overlooking us for those folks a little bit concerned about our state regulatory agencies. Yes, sir.
How do we get your support for the Voting Rights Act?
The Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act, great question, just came forward. The Voting Rights Act, and I opposed it, and obviously some folks here support it. We had record turnout in the last election, the last presidential election. We never have had such an incredible turnout. So as people were speaking about the Voting Rights Act, the obvious question is, we just had record turnout. What are we going to, what problem are we solving? And then they would say, well, what about the Georgia law? The Georgia law is actually more permissive for early voting and Sunday voting than New York State, Colorado, or Delaware, 3 states that are considered reliably blue. Georgia has more access to the ballot than those 3. Now, what it could do, though, is federalize elections. In that, literally, if you wish to move a precinct, you could not do it without federal oversight. So if we have an election in which we had record turnout, wow, people had access to the ballot. And frankly, the complaints about it were coming from the Republican side, not from the Democratic side. And many of those laws being criticized are more permissive than in states which would be considered blue strongholds. Then I didn't see the problem to address. I will say this. I've gotten increasingly skeptical about federalizing issues that can be politicized. And whichever party controls Washington, D.C., uses the levers of power to manipulate the results of the next election to their benefit. And that is true whether it is the right or the left. I am much more comfortable with state officials and local officials being accountable to local voters and state voters making decisions as regards ballot access. So that's also kind of my philosophical, if you will. Yes, sir.
Are there any talks of multimodal transportation in that bill?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. Is there anything about multimodal transportation? There is, both because there is money for ports, waterways, roads and highways, as well as freight rail. But there's also a different pot of money that will go specifically to multimodal areas of transportation. So there's other pots of money. For example, there's another pot of money for, there's another pot of money for, somebody fell, but she appears to be okay. There's another pot of money, for example, for roads that would be used to evacuate areas that are in danger of being hit by a storm.
Okay.
Maybe one more question. I'm sorry, sir.
Well, I understand that we have a lot of different companies here, such as Amazon, and we have a lot of great ports here, but we just don't have that multimodal aspect to bring everything together. For example, FedEx may fly into New Orleans outside of Baton Rouge, and we have a great airport here, to actually truck in from Baton Rouge to the Amazon facility. So I was just wondering if there's anything about that.
And there is.
Senator,
Hey, Linda.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd address, I know there's a lot in the news on supply chain problems that we're having in the country. And one of the things that irks me is that there's so many goods and services come from Asia and come to the California coastline through their ports. And I was wondering if you'd elaborate a little bit more on, you've talked a little bit about it, but how it's going to position our ports to get more of that business and to benefit from that supply chain.
Yeah, great question. There's going to be, again, off the top of my head, I think it's $9 billion for ports and waterways. Now, for us to get those major cargo containers coming from Asia, we have to have a deep water access through the Mississippi River. Currently, they're deepening it to 50 feet. And we also have to have ports, container ports that can manage it. And then we have to have the multimodal transportation that can take those containers and rapidly get them out. We are currently developing that down in Plaquemines and Orleans Parish, in St. Bernard. There's some controversy, so we have to see how it plays. But that is the vision, at least, of the people running the ports, and two different groups kind of competing. This bill will better position for our port to be able to compete with the West Coast ports in terms of bringing stuff in. We're a little bit inland. We're not a savanna, so we have to have that deepening of the river. This bill helps that. I'm getting the hook. Thank you all very much.